He is a nationally recognized expert on cybersecurity, privacy, identity theft, fraud, and personal finance. A highly sought-after speaker who has distinguished himself as a fierce consumer advocate for the past 40 years. Adam Levin is the chairman and founder of CyberScout and co-founder of Credit.com. He is the author of the critically acclaimed book Swiped and the former director of the New Jersey Division of Consumer Affairs. His mission is to educate consumers, businesses, law enforcement officials, and lawmakers on identity management, protection, privacy, credit, and election security issues. He has appeared on the Today Show, Good Morning America, CBS, CNBC, and more. He's also a regular commentator for the New York Times, Associated Press, Wall Street Journal, and USA Today. Meet the leaders shaping the new era of credit. This is the VantageScore podcast. Today, we talk to Adam Levin, founder of CyberScout and Credit.com. Part 1.
My father was one of the creators of the concept of the strip shopping center. And he was also, at one time, the chief shareholder of MGM, and then one of the chief shareholders at Gulf and Western. And at the time he died, he was CEO of Madison Square Garden. He was just an amazing entrepreneur. When it came to real estate, he could smell a location. As they always say in real estate, it's location, location, location. He was a genius when it came to actually siting a shopping center. And he had certain shopping centers that literally became the center of the towns that grew up around them. Now, every Saturday, he and I would go out to see another one of his projects that was under construction. He built about 10 million square feet of union construction. So I learned a lot on those days, and unfortunately, he passed away way too young. He was 62. I was only 21. So I kind of missed the real educational years that I could have had with him as I started to gain a greater appreciation for business. He added me onto his credit card when I went to college. I went suitably crazy when I had a credit card. It was this wonderful magic piece of plastic that you handed to people. Didn't have to worry about the consequence till the end of the month, and it wasn't my consequence to worry about. It was his, and he reminded me often, to the point where he severely limited my ability to use that magical piece of plastic. It was an American Express card, as I remember, and it wasn't so much a limit as he would call me every couple of days and say, "I'm a little worried that you're getting up there a little bit." I studied constitutional law and political science at Stanford University in Palo Alto, then went on to University of Michigan School of Law, where I studied environmental law. What was your first job out of college? Well, my first job in theory was I was running for the United States House of Representatives. I passed the bar. I wanted to stay involved in politics, and I wanted a position that could give me sufficient profile that I would have the opportunity to run again for at least the House of Representatives. So I went to work as a volunteer for the New Jersey Division of Consumer Affairs, and after a year and a half, the director, who was then elevated to Commissioner of Banking on her way ultimately to become an Associate Justice of the New Jersey Supreme Court, recommended that the governor appoint me as Consumer Affairs Director, where I had the privilege and joy of serving for 5 years. And New Jersey Consumer Affairs was very well known as being one of the most aggressive and powerful consumer protection agencies in the country during the 70s and 80s, and had a lot of influence on things that occurred around the country. When it came to consumer protection, we worked very closely with the Federal Trade Commission, and I was involved in a number of hearings with everything from health spas to credit to a host of consumer issues. And Weave in New Jersey was the first, working with the consumer advocate of Dade County, Florida, Walter Dartland, who passed away a couple of years ago. We created Tell Consumer. Now, in those days, there was Tell Law, Tell Med. That's where you would call and you could ask for tapes that would be played that would educate you about either your rights or things that would be of interest in the medical world. So we created a series of tapes on what your consumer rights were, both in the Miami area and in the New Jersey area. And it became wildly popular. Thousands of people would call in. It was a joint program between Consumer Affairs and the Division of Motor Vehicles. So every month when thousands and thousands of driver's license and registration renewals would go out. They would send out information about Tell Consumer, and then we would get thousands of phone calls. It was a wonderful effort at empowering consumers, in educating consumers. It was a good thing for both consumers and for business. And as we used to say at New Jersey Consumer Affairs, that we are not anti-business by any means, because you can be pro-consumer and pro-legitimate business simultaneously. That's the way government should be. That's the way, actually, we operated in New Jersey. Well, while I was at Consumer Affairs, the one of the 28 agencies under the Director of Consumer Affairs was the State Office of Consumer Protection. And I noticed during the years I was there that almost a third of all the complaints we received related to credit. So it was something that kind of piqued my interest, and it was all about how do we better educate people? How do we better protect people? How do we create an environment where people don't view credit as this horrible black cloud that is there to destroy their lives? How do we make people understand the fact that credit can be a wonderful means to increase your economic security, to give you an improved quality of life, that it was an empowerment tool if treated properly? How we started Credit.com was, it was all about creating a book about credit empowerment, and an infomercial. But along the way, it was determined that it was very expensive to do that and that everybody wanted a piece of the action. So my partner came to me and said, there's this new thing. It's called the internet, and I think it may work. Well, he was certainly right. 23 years later, we were able to sell Credit.com for a lovely New Year's Eve in 2015. And it's a situation where Credit.com really was one of the pioneers. It was a pioneer .com. It survived the .com storm, and it grew. And also at the time, Credit.com was thriving and growing. Credit Karma came along. Credit Sesame came along. More and more organizations became interested in the whole concept of how do you make credit scores available to people as opposed to something they felt like they were being almost extorted in order to get. And of course, now you have the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which has been encouraging people to provide free credit scores. And we've had many changes in the law. I mean, we now have, as a result of a new law, free credit freezes, which was unheard of back in the old days. It was one of the earliest websites. We actually went online in 1994. So that was a long time ago, which never got finished. Never got finished because when we went online and we were researching different products and services and speaking with the different credit reporting agencies, we just got so caught up in the whole environment, the .com world, and the ability to communicate through this wonderful new medium that's really wanted to do. We were creating content. We were communicating with people. We were getting, you were getting instant feedback. People would show up on the website every day and they would buy certain products and services, and it was a real up. Our stories were probably read by 30 or 40 million people over the period of a month, depending upon what outlets were running the stories and the size and reach of those particular outlets. Someone once said to me, so now that you're selling your baby, how do you feel about that? I said, well, Credit.com is my baby, but the true love of my life was the other company that I founded in 2003, which at the time was known as Identity Theft 911, that then became IDT 911, that is now CyberScout. The evolution of the name change was that when a number of companies hired us, they said, if we're having an issue, to have a company named Identity Theft 911 could be scaring our clients half to death. So is there a way you could tone down the name? And so a number of people said, well, IDT 911. That was fine, except to reporters in particular, the question was, now, are you an alarm company or a phone company? And at the time, we were also expanding into Europe. CyberScout is a global company. We operate in the U.S., the EU, Canada, Asia, Malaysia, and Australia. We work with people in all those different areas. We now have over 45 million consumers through hundreds of insurance companies, financial services organizations, through employee benefit programs. We are also the designated identity theft service provider and breach response organization for over 800,000 businesses through cyber liability policies throughout the world. We started a podcast company, Loudtree Media, and I'm involved in a number of other companies that are growing at this moment. So I'm hopeful. The great thing about being in a position to invest in different things that interest you is at some point, at least one or two work. And when they work, it's worth all of the agony that you put into the investment decisions. Biggest trends are phishing attacks, which are growing on a daily basis, and certainly after the increase of hostilities with Iran, who have been, as a country and with actual individuals in the country that have nothing to do with the government, they've been a pretty effective hacking machine, and their exploits are well known. Everything from attacking dams in upstate New York to the ransomware attack in Atlanta to bringing down bank websites a few years ago, one by one, in denial of service attacks, to disinformation campaigns that they're involved in terms of American politics, along with Russia, China, and North Korea. So we see phishing attacks. I call it the pantheon of ishings. You might say the four ishings of the cyber apocalypse, but everything from generic phishing, which is dear cardholder, dear member, dear policyholder, dear account holder, to spear phishing, dear Jeff, dear Daniela, to vishing, which is voice over internet protocol phishing attacks. That just means you get a phone call from an entity that you think is the real deal. Your caller ID could even say the name of the organization, but it's spoofed. And you answer the phone, they will tell you that they are the Internal Revenue Service, the Social Security Administration, the Jury Commission in your county, the tech support team from Apple and Microsoft. They may say that they're involved with the security department of a financial institution, that there's a problem with your credit card or with the IRS that you haven't paid your bill, or if it's Social Security Administration, your Social Security number has been suspended, which it can't happen. But you can pay and solve the whole problem. Another very dangerous trend we see is ransomware. And ransomware is you click on a link or open an attachment, it has malware, and all of a sudden your files are frozen, and there might be a skull staring back at you on your computer with a countdown clock ticking, basically saying if you don't make a Bitcoin payment in a specific amount of time, that your files will either be encrypted forever with you unable to access them, or they're going to be deleted. So people go into a panic. And then you have situations like with Baltimore and Atlanta where they refuse to pay the ransomware. You've had situations like cities in Florida and California, medical institutions that have experienced ransomware attacks that have paid the ransom. In some cases, they've gotten the decryption key so they could unlock the files. In some cases, the folks who perpetrated the ransomware attack had no idea how to unlock the files in the first place, but they were happy to take the money. And now there's even a newer twist, and this is part of the Iranian hacking scheme, but it's now being adopted by others, is that they lock up your files and then they wipe them, period. They're all gone. And they've perhaps convinced you to pay them the money, and while you were doing that and they were in the process of doing what they did, They accessed your files, they copied the information, and now they're threatening you that if you don't pay them more, they're going to release the information. So now you have a data breach situation as opposed to just a ransomware situation. And you're facing not only paying a ransom or dealing with that, but also dealing with regulators and class action lawsuit attorneys, depending upon how many people are actually using your site. There was a great line in The Karate Kid where he effectively said, the best way to defend against a punch is not to be there. Well, when you're talking about ransomware, the best way to defend yourself against ransomware is doing things that will protect your devices, better secure your devices, as well as backing up your data. So in the event you really have a problem where they wipe the data off your drives and it's gone forever, you have a backup. And that backup was done, let's say, just a few hours ago. So you may have lost an hour or two of transactions, but your entire business isn't gone as a result of one of these attacks. I wrote a book called Swiped. And what the book talks about really is how you protect yourself in a world full of scammers, phishers, and identity thieves. And the way to do it, and works for businesses as well as consumers, as well as government agencies, is follow what I call the 3 M's. How do you minimize your risk of exposure, reduce your attackable surface? Not so easy in a world with 20 billion Internet of Things devices surrounding us, listening to us, tracking us, providing information back to manufacturers, many with manufacturer default passwords that are for sale on the dark web or available from manufacturers if you just read a manual. So how do you do that? How do you effectively monitor so you know you have a problem? And how do you manage the damage? And even though there are certain tweaks, whether it's an agency, a business, or a consumer, it really falls to a few things. First, you need to create a culture of privacy and security. Oh, and the 3rd M, by the way, is manage the damage. So minimize risk of exposure, monitor, manage the damage. But where privacy is built in at the core, and certainly in the credit industry, we are aware of a very unfortunate event involving a specific credit reporting agency that exposed 150 million people. In that case, it was failure to follow procedure and failure to monitor, and then failure to properly manage the damage, and resulted in a settlement of hundreds of millions of dollars, and still tens of millions of people scared out of their minds that their information has been released. So how do you minimize your risk of exposure? Well, long and strong passwords or password management systems, passwords unique to whatever it is you're doing. Do not use a simple password and then share it across your universe of websites, because it's important to remember that, let's say you have a very complicated password. Just because it's complicated doesn't mean it isn't discovered as a result of a breach of a website where your credentials were involved. You train your employees. You use two-factor authentication. Some people go, oh, great, I do two-factor authentication, and I came up with great security questions. Well, the problem with the security question is that most people post most things about themselves all over the place. So anyone that's following them can figure out the answers to most of the security questions. So I would say to people, when you create security questions, lie like a superhero. Bruce Wayne's not going to tell you he's Batman. Clark Kent doesn't run around going, I'm Superman. So lie like a superhero, but don't be so creative that you can't remember the answers you gave, so you end up locking yourself out of that particular account. The second thing is that, sending a code to a cell phone is the preferred way, and a lot of people think the most effective way in part of two-factor authentication. The only danger is there are people involved in what's called SIM jacking, where they basically gain access to your mobile device, and you don't know they've gained access to it, and they've transferred it to them. So when the code comes, it comes to them, not to you. So two-factor authentication at least gives you a clue that something is going on and it's not right. But it's not the perfect silver bullet. That's why we tell people, do a PIN on your mobile account. Don't just have a mobile account that anyone who could masquerade as you, that knows enough information about you, could call a sympathetic or unwitting customer service representative at a mobile provider and convince them they're you, and then have the number switched to another device. So that's part of it. Make sure your devices are secure. Make sure you don't simply download every app that seems cool, regardless of where you're downloading that app from. Because unbeknownst to you, you could be agreeing to allow them to access your contact list. Now, they do that because they simply want to communicate. It's a marketing tool for them. They want to be able to go after everyone you know, and they now have the information. So if they have enough people that are downloading the app, that are giving them enough contact information, that's one of the greatest lead lists ever. So they pursue that. Basically, you have to agree to something. Read what you're agreeing to. New laws like the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe, the California Consumer Protection Act, which just went into effect, which is all about how do consumers gain control over their data, or how do we at least claw back some of the privacy that has been stripped from us by those quite similar to someone who made a statement that privacy is dead, who owns an extremely large social media network. How do we claw it back? So again, as part of the minimizing the risk of exposure, it's important to have an idea of what data is out there, how your data is being used, and then being in a position to assert control so that you can begin to narrow your attackable surface. In addition to which, freezing your credit, it helps you narrow your attackable surface. And it's free now, so why wouldn't you do it? Shredding helps you narrow your attackable surface. Being alert, paying attention, understanding what the threats are, all about education and training. And, more and more companies are actually involved in education and training now than ever before, and that's an important thing for companies, having anti-phishing attack training so that people begin to spot those telltale things like, is that grammar really right? Does that logo look right?
This podcast is brought to you by VantageScore Solutions, a higher level of confidence. Thanks for listening.